Hi, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we are diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery. Smart, sharp, and worth every minute. It was a Tuesday in October. Cold enough that the radiators were ticking their protest. And Wolfe was upstairs with the orchids until 11. Which meant I had the office to myself, and a copy of the Gazette open to the crossword when the doorbell rang. I want to say I had a premonition, but that would be embroidering the truth, which Wolfe tells me is a vice worse than laziness. What I had was mild curiosity, because nobody with an appointment book worth consulting rings a doorbell at 9:40 in the morning, and this particular visitor, when I opened the door and sized him up through the one-way glass first, looked like a man who kept appointment books the way other men keep sidearms, close and always loaded. "Sterling Cobb," he said, handing me a card before I'd asked for one. "I need to see Mr. Wolfe. It concerns a death and a document, and I'll tell you plainly, I don't have the patience this morning to be told he's unavailable." I've had bigger men than Sterling Cobb try to walk through me, and none of them managed it. But I liked his directness enough to let him into the front room instead of leaving him on the stoop to reconsider his manners. He was somewhere past 60, dressed the way lawyers dress when they've stopped needing to impress anyone but themselves. Good wool, no flash, and he had the kind of pale, restless eyes that suggested he hadn't slept much and wasn't happy about admitting it. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't see anyone before 11, I told him. "That's not policy, that's orchids. You can wait, or you can tell me about it, and I'll decide how urgently he needs to hear it." "It's murder," Cobb said, "or it's the cleverest fraud I've encountered in 31 years of the state law. I haven't decided which. And that's precisely the trouble." That earned him a chair in the office, instead of the front room. And it earned me a decision to interrupt the orchid schedule, which is a liberty I take perhaps 4 times a year, and always regret slightly, the way you regret waking a sleeping dog, even when the house is on fire. Wolfe came down at 11:06, 4 minutes late by his own clock, which meant he'd noticed the interruption and was registering displeasure the only way he permits himself, through punctuality's small rebellions. He got himself arranged behind the desk, rang for beer, and looked at Cobb the way he looks at a species of orchid he suspects has been mislabeled. "Mr. Cobb," he said, "Archie tells me you use the word murder in my front room. I find that word is frequently a rhetorical flourish employed by people who mean inconvenience. Which do you mean?" "I mean I don't know," Cobb said, "and that is the most honest sentence I will say to you this morning, so I'd ask you to remember it." He set a leather folder on the desk, but didn't open it yet. Julian Marsh died 17 days ago, heart failure, according to his physician, in his library at Larchmont, sometime after midnight. He was 68, he had a cardiac history, and nobody, not his family, not the police, not the coroner, thought for one instant to question it. I certainly didn't. I drew up condolence letters. I began the probate. "And now," Wolfe said, "now I have a document that shouldn't exist, found in a place it shouldn't have been, dated a day it couldn't have been written, and it is going to give 1/3 of a $41 million estate to a woman none of Julian's family had ever heard of before last Thursday." Wolfe's eyes had gone to slits, which is as close as he comes to sitting up straight. "Explain the impossibility of the date before you explain the document. I distrust adjectives that arrive before their nouns." Cobb almost smiled, the first crack in 31 years of composure. "Julian executed 6 codicils to his will over the last 11 years. I drafted all 6 myself, witnessed each one properly, filed each one properly. I know his testamentary intentions the way I know my own signature. 10 days ago, going through his library at the family's request, cataloging the books for the estate inventory, nothing more, I found a 7th Codicil, handwritten in what appears to be Julian's own hand, folded inside a first edition of Bleak House. It's dated the 11th of October, signed, with 2 witnesses." "The impossibility," Wolfe said. "Julian was in Boston on the 11th of October," Cobb said. I have his hotel bill, his driver's log, and a dinner engagement with 4 other men who will all swear to it. He did not return to Larchmont until the evening of the 12th. He was dead by 1 in the morning on the 13th. The document that will hand $14 million to Miss Elena Vandermeer was apparently written and witnessed on a day its author spent 200 miles away. I looked up from my notebook because that's the kind of sentence that deserves a man's full attention, and I saw Wolfe's finger tracing a small circle on the arm of his chair, which is his equivalent of another man rubbing his hands together. "The witnesses," Wolfe said. "Who are they?" "That," Cobb said, "is the second thing that's going to ruin your morning. One is Julian's private secretary, a young man named Perry Voss, who swears on his mother's grave that he witnessed Julian sign that document in the Larchmont Library on the 11th, a date on which I can independently prove Julian never set foot in Larchmont. The other witness is Julian's own physician, Dr. Holloway Reese, the same man who signed the death certificate citing cardiac arrest and who has not returned a single one of my calls in 6 days." Wolfe rang for beer a second time, which meant he'd stopped being reluctant and started being interested, though he'd sooner confess to enjoying a communist rally than admit as much before the second bottle. "You want to know," he said, "whether the document is a forgery constructed with remarkable audacity, or whether it is genuine, and the impossibility lies elsewhere, in the dates you believe you can prove, or in your understanding of where Mr. Marsh actually was." "I want to know if Julian Marsh was murdered," Cobb said, and for the first time his controlled lawyer's voice had a crack running clean through the middle of it. "Because I have begun to suspect that whoever wrote that codicil knew he was going to die before the 11th of October ever arrived, and simply hadn't decided yet what to do about the date." Nobody said anything for a moment. Fritz's footsteps went past in the hall, and somewhere above us a radiator gave its opinion of the conversation. Wolfe sat with his eyes closed, which I've learned means his brain has gone somewhere I can't follow. And when he opened them again, he looked at Cobb with something that wasn't quite sympathy, but was in the same neighborhood. "Mr. Cobb," he said, "you will leave that document with Mr. Goodwin. You will also provide by tomorrow morning a list of everyone with knowledge of the 6 prior codicils, everyone who stood to gain or lose by a 7th, and the name and address of Dr. Holloway Reese, who Mr. Goodwin will locate before lunch." He picked up his beer at last. "I do not chase forgers, and I do not chase murderers, but I confess a professional curiosity about a dead man who apparently postdated or antedated his own testament. Miss Vandermeer, who is she?" Cobb's mouth went thin. "That," he said, "is the third thing that's going to ruin your morning. Nobody in the Marsh family has ever met her. But according to Julian's household staff, she visited Larchmont 11 times in the last 4 months, always in the evening, always let in by Perry Voss, and always, without exception, on a night when Julian's wife was somewhere else." Wolfe set his glass down very precisely, which is a thing he does when he's already 3 moves ahead of everyone else in the room, and is deciding how much of the board to show us. "Archie," he said, "get your notebook properly open. We have work." By Wednesday afternoon, I'd assembled what Wolfe likes to call a working roster, and what I call a headache with names attached. Cobb had come through with his list, and I'd spent the morning on the phone in a voice I reserve for people who don't yet know they're about to be interviewed by the fattest detective in Manhattan, which is a voice heavy on courtesy and light on explanation. 4 of them agreed to come to the brownstone that afternoon, which told me something already. People with nothing to hide usually make you work harder for an appointment than people who suspect the alternative is worse. Dr. Holloway Reese arrived first, at 2, looking like a man who'd rehearsed being unbothered and hadn't quite finished the performance. He was tall, silver at the temples in the way that costs money to maintain, and he had the practiced warmth of a physician who'd spent 30 years telling wealthy people they were dying without ever raising his voice. "Mr. Wolfe," he said, taking the red leather chair like he owned the lease on it. I understand Sterling's gotten himself worked up over a piece of paper. I'll tell you what I told him. I signed that codicil. I watched Julian Marsh sign it. If the dates don't reconcile, that's a calendar problem, not a murder. You watched him sign it in the Larchmont Library, Wolfe said, on the 11th of October. I did. Mr. Cobb has a hotel bill, a driver's log, and 4 dinner companions who placed Mr. Marsh in Boston that day. Reese's jaw did something small and controlled, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't Archie Goodwin and paid to notice. Then Sterling's evidence is wrong, or my memory of the date is wrong, and I'd sooner trust my memory. I've known Julian for 22 years. I don't misplace a signature. You misplace a calendar page, evidently, Wolfe murmured, and rang for beer, which is his way of telling a witness the subject is closed for now, but not forgotten. Mr. Marsh's cardiac history. Tell me about it. Angina, controlled with medication, for the better part of a decade. I'd warned him repeatedly about stress, exertion, the usual. His death didn't surprise me in the least. I signed the certificate without hesitation, and I'd sign it again tomorrow. Did anyone have access to his medication who shouldn't have? That landed somewhere it shouldn't have, because Reese's hand went to his tie for exactly 1 second before he caught it and set both hands flat on his knees instead. I don't follow the implication. Neither do I yet, Wolfe said. I'm gathering the furniture before I decide where to put it. That will be all for now, Doctor, though I expect I'll want you again. Reese left with considerably less warmth than he'd arrived with, and I made a note in the margin of my pad. Hand to tie. Cardiac question. Because a man who's been signing death certificates for 22 years doesn't flinch at a question about medication, unless the question's aimed closer than he'd like. Perry Voss came next, and he was a different animal entirely. 28, maybe 30, with the eager, slightly hunted look of a young man who'd attached his whole future to an older man's good opinion, and hadn't worked out yet what to do now that the older man was dead. He sat forward in his chair like he was interviewing for a job, which in a sense he was, except the job was staying out of a courtroom. I witnessed the codicil, he said, before Wolfe had asked him a single question. I know what everyone thinks, and I'm telling you I witnessed it, in the library, and Mr. Marsh was there, and Dr. Reese was there, and I don't care what a hotel bill says. I know what I saw. You're certain of the date, Wolfe said. I'm certain of the room, and I'm certain of the document. I couldn't swear to the calendar date under torture, if you want the honest truth of it. I don't check dates when my employer hands me a pen and asks me to witness his signature. I just witness it. He spread his hands, a gesture that struck me as slightly too rehearsed for a man claiming spontaneous honesty. Ask anyone. I'm terrible with dates. Julian used to tease me about it. Yet you're certain enough to swear to it in a probate contest worth $14 million, Wolfe observed. Voss's ears went pink. I'm certain I witnessed him sign something. Cobb wants to argue about which Tuesday it was. That's between him and a calendar, not between him and my integrity. I watched him while he said it, and here's what I saw. A young man who believed roughly 60% of what was coming out of his own mouth, which in my experience is the most dangerous kind of witness, because he's not lying so much as he's decided which parts of the truth he can afford to remember. Miss Vandermeer, Wolfe said, you let her into the house on 11 occasions. Voss's composure, such as it was, took a visible knock. I don't see what that has to do with a legal document. Everything possibly. Nothing possibly. Answer the question. She came to see Mr. Marsh, privately. That's all I know, and all I'll say, because it wasn't my business, and it isn't yours either, with respect. He stood up before Wolfe had dismissed him, which is a thing almost nobody does in that office, and it told me the boy had more nerve than his pink ears suggested. I answered your questions about the codicil. I don't have to sit here and let you dig through a dead man's private life. Wolfe let him go without argument, which surprised me, until he murmured once the door had shut, A man who draws a line that firmly has usually already crossed it once and doesn't intend to again. Get me the third one, Archie. The third one was Julian Marsh's widow, Constance, and she came into that office like a woman who'd been dreading it for a week, and had decided the only dignity left to her was punctuality. She was handsome, in the way expensive grief is handsome. Composed, dark-suited, every hair where she'd put it. And she looked at Wolfe with the flat, assessing patience of someone who'd spent 30 years married to lawyers, and knew exactly how this kind of conversation was supposed to go. "I assume you want to ask about the girl," she said, before Wolfe had gotten past his opening pleasantry. "Everyone wants to ask about the girl. I'll save you the trouble of working up to it delicately. Wolfe, because delicacy bores me. Yes, I knew my husband was seeing someone. No, I didn't know her name until Sterling told me last week. And no, I did not sit up nights plotting to have him poisoned over it, if that's the direction your face is pointing. I hadn't accused you of anything, Mrs. Marsh. You didn't have to. I've been the widow for 17 days and the suspect for about 6 hours, and I can tell the difference in how people look at me." She said it without self-pity, which I respected, and settled deeper into the chair like a woman prepared to stay as long as necessary to get it over with. Julian had affairs. This was not the first, and if he'd lived another decade it wouldn't have been the last. I stopped being wounded by it around year 12 of a 31-year marriage. What I want to know, what I actually care about, is whether some girl I've never met is entitled to a third of my husband's estate, on the strength of a piece of paper my own attorney thinks he might have signed while he was 200 miles away in Boston. "You were where, on the 11th of October?" Wolfe asked. "At the house, in Larchmont. Alone, since you'll ask next, because Julian was in Boston, and the staff had the evening off for Voss's birthday, of all the inconvenient coincidences." She looked at Wolfe with something that might have been challenge, or might have been exhaustion. With a woman that controlled, I couldn't yet tell the two apart. "So no, Mr. Wolfe, I have no alibi worth the name, and if you're building toward asking whether I could have let myself into my own library and forged my husband's signature on a document that hands away a third of his fortune, the answer is that I could have. I simply didn't." Wolfe studied her for a long moment, the way he studies an orchid that's either about to bloom spectacularly or die of something he hasn't diagnosed yet. "Mrs. Marsh," he said finally, "who besides yourself and Mr. Marsh, Voss, had the run of that house on an evening the staff was away?" For the first time since she'd sat down, Constance Marsh hesitated. Not long, a half-second at most, but I caught it. And so, I was fairly sure, did Wolfe. "My husband's business partner," she said. "Desmond Cray. He had a key. He'd had one for 11 years. Her mouth tightened. "And he had rather more reason than I did to want that codicil to exist, if you know anything at all about what Julian and Desmond were fighting over before he died. Desmond Cray didn't come to us. He made us come to him, which was its own kind of statement. And Wolfe, who regards leaving the brownstone with roughly the enthusiasm most men reserve for dental surgery, nearly refused on principle. He relented only because I pointed out that a man who won't walk through your door is usually a man worth finding out why. And Wolfe, grumbling the whole while about the indignity of taxicabs, set me alone, which was the outcome I'd been angling for from the start. Cray's offices were on the 19th floor of a building on Madison. All glass and hard angles, the kind of place decorated to make visitors feel slightly underdressed. He kept me waiting 11 minutes. I timed it, because 11 minutes is exactly the amount of time a man spends deciding how much of the truth he can afford to hand you. And when he finally waved me in, he was standing at the window with his back to the door, which is a trick people think looks powerful, and mostly just looks rude. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, turning at last, "I understand your employer sends errand boys instead of coming himself. I'll take that as a professional courtesy, since I have no particular wish to entertain a man who solves crimes from an armchair." He was somewhere around Marsh's age, trim in a way that suggested a personal trainer rather than good genetics, and he had the smooth, unhurried manner of a man who'd spent 30 years being the most dangerous person in every room he entered, and had stopped needing to prove it. "Mr. Wolfe doesn't leave his house for people who aren't paying him," I said. "You're not paying him. You're just a name on a list," he once explained. "So let's skip the part where you needle me about his weight, and get to the part where you tell me what you and Julian Marsh were fighting about." That got a thin smile out of him, more respect than amusement. "Direct? Fine. Julian and I built Marsh Cray Holdings from nothing over 22 years, and in the last 18 months, he developed an idea that I intended to see buried before it saw daylight: selling the firm's controlling interest to a consortium out of Chicago. It would have made him considerably richer and left me running a division of somebody else's company. I told him as much, repeatedly, and not gently. "How not gently?" "There's a partnership agreement, Mr. Goodwin, drafted 11 years ago, that gives either partner the right to force a buyout of the other at fair market value under certain conditions. Julian was maneuvering to trigger it against me. I was maneuvering to trigger it against him first. It was not, I promise you, a friendship in its final season." "And the Seventh Codicil?" Cray's face did something careful. "Sterling Cobb doesn't keep secrets well when he's frightened. And he's been frightened all week. If that document stands, a third of Julian's estate, including his shares in the firm, passes to a woman I've never met. Which means I'd be negotiating a buyout with a stranger instead of a widow I've known for 2 decades and a partner's estate I understood. That is not, I'll grant you, an outcome that helps me." He spread his hands, the universal gesture of a man showing you he isn't holding anything. "Which is precisely why I had no reason to forge it, Mr. Goodwin, and every reason to want it torn up." It was a clean answer, maybe too clean, the kind of logic a smart man builds when he's had a week to build it. I filed it and moved on. "You had a key to the Larchmont house." "I did. Still do, unless someone's changed the locks out of spite. No hesitation there at all. Julian and I had an arrangement going back a decade. Either of us could use the library for work when the city offices got too loud with lawyers. I was there perhaps twice a month. I make no secret of it, and neither will the housekeeper, if you bother to ask her." "Were you there on the 11th of October?" "No," Cray said. "I was in Philadelphia, meeting with the very Chicago consortium Julian was so eager to court behind my back, trying to talk them out of a deal that would have gutted my position in the firm. I have 4 witnesses and a hotel folio, and unlike apparently everyone else connected to this business, my alibi doesn't require anyone to trust my memory of a Tuesday." I thanked him for his time, which is a thing you say to people whether you mean it or not, and rode the elevator down, turning over the one detail that didn't sit flat. A man that careful, that rehearsed, answering every question before I'd finished asking it. Innocent men usually stumble somewhere. Cray hadn't stumbled once, and in my experience, that's its own kind of tell. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe had summoned Cobb again, and the lawyer arrived looking like a man who hadn't slept since Tuesday, and had stopped pretending otherwise. "I've spoken with the county," Cobb said, settling into the red chair with the particular stiffness of a man delivering bad news he's already rehearsed twice. "There was no formal autopsy. Dr. Reese signed the certificate. Cardiac arrest, consistent with history. No red flags raised, no reason for the coroner to look further. Julian was cremated 4 days after his death, per his own written instructions, which were on file with my office and dated 11 years ago." Wolfe's eyes had gone to slits. Convenient instructions. "Julian was meticulous about his affairs, Mr. Wolfe. Cremation instructions included. I don't think it's sinister on its own. But it does mean that if there was anything to find, it's ash in an urn at Larchmont, and there is no undoing that now." Cobb rubbed at his temple. "There's something else. I went back through Julian's desk calendar, his real one, the leather one his secretary kept before Voss took over that duty 8 months ago, and I found something that doesn't sit right." "Go on." Julian's habit for as long as I've known him was to note his whereabouts in the calendar himself, in his own hand, in addition to whatever Voss typed up officially. Small notes, B for Boston, L for Larchmont, that sort of shorthand. On the 11th of October, the calendar has a B in Julian's own hand, Boston, consistent with the hotel bill, the driver's log, the dinner companions. He looked up. But underneath it, in pencil, someone has written the letter L, not Julian's hand. I've spent 31 years reading his correspondence, Mr. Wolfe. Wolfe, and I would stake my license that he didn't write that pencil mark. The room went quiet enough that I heard Fritz's knife going through something in the kitchen 2 floors down. Someone, Wolfe said slowly, wanted a written record, however small, however easily overlooked, placing Julian Marsh in Larchmont on the 11th of October. Not merely a forged codicil, a supporting fabrication planted in a private calendar weeks or months before anyone thought to contest a will. He was quiet a moment, his finger tracing its small circle on the chair arm. That is not the work of a man improvising after a death, Mr. Cobb. That is the work of a man planning ahead of one. Cobb's face had gone the color of old paper. You're saying Julian was murdered, and whoever did it began laying groundwork for a $14 million inheritance before he ever died. I am saying, Wolfe said, that someone believed, with enough confidence to commit forgery in advance, that Julian Marsh's death was a foregone conclusion rather than a surprise. That is a very particular kind of confidence, Mr. Cobb, and men do not generally possess it about events outside their own control. He rang for beer, which meant the conversation for him had entered its second and more interesting phase. Archie, I want Elena Vandermeer in this office by Friday, and I want to know precisely what Dr. Reese prescribed Julian Marsh in the final month of his life, and whether every pill in that prescription can be accounted for. Elena Vandermeer did not look like a homewrecker, which was the first thing that struck me when I opened the door for her Friday afternoon. She looked like a school teacher or a museum docent. Early 30s, dressed plainly, dark hair pulled back with no particular effort at effect, and eyes that had the wary, over-alert quality of somebody who'd spent the last 2 weeks being looked at like a criminal by people who'd never met her. Mr. Goodwin, she said, before I'd introduced myself, I'd like to get that out of the way before we start, so you can stop deciding how to phrase your first question delicately. I don't do delicate, I said. Ask Wolfe. Come in. She sat in the red leather chair like she expected it to bite her, hands folded tight in her lap, and Wolfe studied her for a full 15 seconds before he said a word, which is a habit that unsettles almost everyone, and had precisely that effect on her. Miss Vandermeer, he said finally, you are named in a document worth $14 million, executed under circumstances that suggest either extraordinary fortune on your part or considerable jeopardy. I intend to determine which. You may begin by telling me how you came to know Julian Marsh. I taught his granddaughter piano, she said. 3 years ago, Marisol, Constance's daughter's girl. I still teach her, actually, twice a week, which is how I first met Julian, picking her up some afternoons when her mother was traveling. She unclasped her hands, then reclasped them, a small tell she probably didn't know she had. We became friendly. Then, over the last year, we became closer than friendly. I won't pretend otherwise to you, Mr. Wolfe, because Sterling Cobb already knows, and I assume the whole city will know shortly. Did Mr. Marsh discuss his will with you? Once, in September. He said he intended to provide for me. His words, provide for me. And I told him I didn't want it, and I meant that. And I'll say it to you exactly as I said it to him. I have my own income. I did not need or ask for $14 million. And if it were up to me alone, I'd sign it away tomorrow and let his family have every cent. Because I would very much like to stop being the woman everyone in this city believes murdered an old man for his money. There was heat in that last sentence. Real heat, not performed, and I made a note that whatever else was true about Elena Vandermeer, She hadn't come into that office expecting sympathy, and clearly wasn't angling for it. "You were seen at Larchmont on 11 occasions," Wolfe said. "I was invited 11 times, and I went 11 times. Always in the evening, always let in by Perry, and I am not ashamed of it, whatever anyone wants to make of that." She met Wolfe's eyes squarely. "I never once asked Perry to keep it quiet. I assumed, I suppose foolishly, that a 68-year-old man's private life was his own business. Were you at Larchmont on the 11th of October? And there it was, the pause, not long but long enough that I felt the room tighten around it, the way it had tightened around Constance Marsh's half-second hesitation 3 days before. "No," she said. "I was in the city that whole week. I have piano students Tuesday through Thursday every week, without exception, and the 11th was a Tuesday. Ask any of 6 sets of parents." "Yet you hesitated before answering." "I hesitated because I know how it sounds when I tell you I wasn't there. Given that a document dated that day says I was going to inherit a fortune from a man I supposedly wasn't with. I've had 2 weeks to get tired of everyone assuming the worst interpretation of every sentence I say, Mr. Wolfe. That's the whole of my hesitation. Make of it what you like." Wolfe let that sit a moment, then shifted ground the way he does when he's finished testing a witness's nerve and wants to test their knowledge instead. "Did Perry Voss ever discuss the codicils with you, any of the 6 prior ones, or the possibility of a 7th? "Never directly. But—" She stopped herself, and this time the hesitation was different, more calculation than discomfort. "There was one evening, maybe 6 weeks before Julian died, when I arrived and Perry was still in the library with him, and I heard raised voices before I was shown in. Julian was angry. I only caught a fragment, something about 'you had no business drafting anything without Sterling present.' I assumed it was ordinary business friction. Julian was often short with Perry. I didn't think about it again until Sterling told me about this codicil business, and now I think about it rather a lot." Wolfe's finger began its small circle on the chair arm, which meant something had clicked into a slot he'd been holding open. "Perry Voss drafted documents for Mr. Marsh, without Cobb present." "I don't know that for certain. I only know what I overheard, and what I overheard was Julian's temper, not the specifics of what had provoked it." Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, eyes closed, and when he opened them he looked at Elena Vandermeer with something that had shifted from suspicion into a kind of careful, professional attention. "If I told you I believed Julian Marsh was murdered, and that the 7th Codicil was constructed to implicate you as its principal beneficiary, specifically because you made an unusually convenient suspect, a woman with motive, opportunity in the household, and no alibi anyone would think to verify closely, would that surprise you?" She went very still. "You think I was chosen. Not chosen by Julian, chosen by whoever did this." Wolfe nodded slightly. "I think," Wolfe said, "that a $14 million bequest to a mistress is precisely the kind of legacy that discourages careful scrutiny, because everyone is already prepared to believe the worst of her before a single fact is examined. It is, if you'll forgive the ugliness of the observation, an excellent place to hide a murder, behind a scandal loud enough to keep investigators from looking past it." He rang for beer. "That will be all for now, Miss Vandermeer, though I suspect I'll want you once more before this is finished, and I'd advise you to remain findable." She left looking considerably less braced than she'd arrived, which I took as a small mercy on Wolfe's part, intentional or not. Perry Voss came back that evening, summoned rather than invited, and this time he didn't sit forward eagerly. He sat the way a man sits when he's had 3 days to think about a lie, and has started to suspect it isn't holding its shape. "Mr. Voss," Wolfe said, without preamble, "you told me you drafted nothing for Mr. Marsh without Mr. Cobb present. Miss Vandermeer overheard him accuse you of precisely that 6 weeks before his death. I will ask you once, plainly, and I would remind you that a lie told twice in 1 week to 2 different investigators is considerably harder to sustain than a lie told once." Voss's hands, which had been still in his lap, closed slowly into fists. "I drafted a letter," he said finally, quiet. "Not a codicil. A letter about the Cray buyout dispute that Julian wanted phrased carefully before Sterling got hold of it and softened all the teeth out of it." His words. That's what he was angry about. That I'd shown a draft to someone else in the office before he'd approved the final language. It had nothing to do with any will. "Who did you show it to?" The pink crept back up Voss's ears, exactly as it had the first time. And I thought, there it is again. The tell that means the boys decided which parts of the truth he can live with hiding. "Dr. Reese," Voss said at last. "He was at the house that evening. He asked to see it. I didn't think anything of showing him. He'd known Julian for 2 decades. He was practically family. I never imagined it would come up in a conversation about murder, Mr. Wolfe, and I still don't understand why it should." Wolfe's eyes had gone very still, the way they do when a piece of furniture he's been waiting for finally arrives in the room. "Because, Mr. Voss, you have just told me that Dr. Holloway Reese, a man who signed Julian Marsh's death certificate without an autopsy, who cannot account for his own certainty about a disputed date, and who controlled Mr. Marsh's cardiac medication, had access 6 weeks before the death to your handwriting, your habits as a witness, and a private letter concerning the very business dispute that gave Desmond Cray a fortune's worth of motive." He folded his hands over his stomach. "Archie, get me everything Reese has prescribed in the last 18 months, and get it before Sunday." Sunday morning found me on a train to Larchmont with a list of 6 names, and the kind of weather that makes New York suburbs look like postcards nobody asked for. Wolfe doesn't travel for cases, and I don't much blame him. Somebody has to sit in that office fielding phone calls and eating Fritz's cooking, and it might as well be the man who actually likes moving around. The Marsh housekeeper, a stout, no-nonsense woman named Ada Pruitt, who'd worked the place for 19 years, let me into the kitchen with the particular suspicion housekeepers reserve for anyone connected to lawyers, and warmed considerably once I made it clear I wasn't there to ask about silverware inventories. "Dr. Reese," she said, when I got around to him, "came round more than his patients usually warrant, if you want my opinion, which nobody's asked for in 19 years, but I'll give you anyway. Practically lived in that library some weeks. Mr. Marsh's heart, he always said, checking on him. How often is more than usual? Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, the last 2 months before he passed. Always evenings, always with that little black bag." She shook her head. I thought it was devotion. Now Sterling Cobb's got everybody whispering murder, and I don't know what to think anymore, except that I served that man's coffee for 19 years, and I'll not have people saying I should have noticed something. "Did you ever see him with medication? Refilling anything? Adjusting a dose?" "He kept Mr. Marsh's pills in the library cabinet himself, is what I'll tell you, because Mr. Marsh trusted him with it, and didn't like the staff handling his heart medicine. Fussy about it he was, like most men who are frightened of dying and won't say so plainly." She frowned, working something loose from memory. "There was a night, early October, I couldn't swear to the date, when Dr. Reese came by after we'd all gone up, and I only know because I'd come down for water and saw his car still in the drive past 11. Mr. Marsh let him stay, working in the library. That struck me odd even then, because doctors don't usually do their paperwork at another man's house past bedtime. I thanked her, made a note, early October, Reese present past 11 p.m., unverified date, and went looking for the second name on my list. A pharmacist in the village who'd filled Marsh's prescriptions for a decade. Mr. Iverson ran the kind of drugstore that still had a soda counter nobody used anymore. And he was cautious, the way pharmacists are trained to be cautious. Right up until I mentioned that a man was dead and a $14 million document hung on the answer. At which point caution gave way to a genuine, unhurried helpfulness. "Digoxin," he said, pulling a ledger from under the counter without my even asking. "Cardiac glycoside, narrow therapeutic window, meaning the gap between a dose that helps a man's heart and a dose that stops it isn't as wide as you'd want, if you follow me. Dr. Rees had him on a stable maintenance dose for years. Nothing unusual. He ran a finger down a column of dates. Except here, 3 weeks before he passed, Dr. Rees phoned in an adjustment. Increase the dose. Not dramatically, mind. Nothing that'd raise my eyebrow on its own. Physicians titrate dosages all the time as a patient ages. Would that increase on its own kill a man? On its own? Unlikely. Combined with something else that potentiates it, certain diuretics, certain interactions, it's a different conversation entirely. And I'll tell you plainly, Mr. Goodwin, that's a conversation for a toxicologist, not a man who counts pills behind a counter. He closed the ledger. I will say this much for free. Dr. Rees asked me the week after Mr. Marsh died whether our pharmacy kept independent digoxin level records separate from a hospital toxicology screen. I thought it an odd question for a man mourning a long-time patient. I think it rather less odd now. That was worth the train fare on its own, and I said so, and rode back into the city with my notebook a good deal fuller than it had left with. Wolfe was in the office when I got back, working through a stack of correspondence, with the particular gloom he reserves for Sunday afternoons without a proper case to chew on, which improved considerably once I laid out what I had. Digoxin, he said, testing the word the way he tests an unfamiliar vintage. A narrow margin, deliberately widened 3 weeks before death, by the same physician who signed the certificate, without requesting a toxicology screen he had every professional standing to request, and who, after the fact, inquired specifically about records that might reveal exactly that. He set down his pen. That is not proof, Archie. That is architecture. I want to know who built it and why. And I am now reasonably confident it was not built for Mr. Cray's benefit, whatever his motive for wanting the codicil dead. Rees doesn't inherit anything, I said. That's the piece that doesn't fit. He's not named in the will, not in any of the 6 codicils, not in the 7th. Man goes to that much trouble, titrating a dosage and forging a calendar entry, and there's nothing in it for him? Nothing you've found, Wolfe said, which is not the same claim. Get Cobb on the telephone. I want to know whether Dr. Rees has any financial connection to Marsh Cray Holdings, any debt to Julian Marsh personally, or any arrangement, professional, contractual, or otherwise, with Perry Voss. He leaned back, eyes half closed. A man does not commit a murder this patient, this well-constructed, for the pleasure of it. There is a ledger somewhere, with Dr. Cray Rees's name in the column marked Gain, Archie, and I intend to find it before I do anything else in this matter. I got Cobb on the phone, and what he told me 20 minutes later put a very different shape on the whole business than anything we'd had before. There's a loan, Cobb said, his voice tight, with the particular strain of a lawyer discovering he'd missed something. Personal loan, $400,000, from Julian Marsh to Dr. Rees, 18 months ago. No collateral beyond a handshake, structured informally. I only know because Julian mentioned it to me once, offhand, and I never thought to include it in the estate paperwork because it was never formalized in writing that I ever saw. He paused. Sterling, if that loan was never properly documented, and Julian's the only one who could confirm the terms, and Julian is dead, then the debt dies with him, Wolfe finished, when I relate it. Unless someone chooses to remember it. Which means Dr. Rees did not merely stand to lose $400,000 he could likely never have repaid. He stood, upon Julian Marsh's convenient and unquestioned death, to have that debt vanish entirely. An inheritance of silence, Archie, worth considerably more to a desperate man than a line in a will. He reached for the beer Fritz had just brought in. Get Voss back here tomorrow. I believe Dr. Rees did not act alone in constructing his alibi's supporting details, and I intend to learn precisely how much young Mr. Voss understood about what he was witnessing when he swears he saw Julian Marsh sign that codicil. Wolfe didn't call Voss back Monday morning. Instead, he did something that always signals the case has turned a corner in his head. He sent me out for the 6 prior codicils, the original ones, the ones Cobb had drafted and filed properly over 11 years, and he spent 3 hours at his desk with them spread out like a man playing solitaire with a very expensive deck. I sat across from him, doing nothing useful, because when Wolfe gets like that, useful is exactly what he doesn't want from anybody, including Fritz's lunch schedule, which got pushed back 40 minutes to the audible detriment of the household's mood. "Archie," he said finally, around 2 in the afternoon, "read me the witness signatures on each of these 6 documents. Names only." I read them off. Cobb himself had witnessed 4. A notary named Feld had witnessed 2, both from the earlier years. Perry Voss's name appeared nowhere on any of the 6, which made sense, since Voss had only come into Marsh's employ 8 months before his death, well after the 6th Codicil was executed. "So the 7th, Wolfe said, is the only one Voss ever witnessed. The only one Cobb never saw before its existence was contested. The only one drafted, if Miss Vandermeer's account is accurate, sometime around a heated argument in which Julian Marsh accused his own secretary of drafting something without Cobb's knowledge. He set down the 6th Codicil and picked up nothing, which meant he was done with props and ready to think aloud, a performance he reserves for moments when he's fairly certain he already knows the answer and wants Archie Goodwin as an audience while he confirms it. Consider the architecture, Archie, piece by piece. A physician with a narrow, well-timed dosage adjustment and a debt that dies conveniently with his patient. A secretary who drafts documents outside his authority and swears, not quite convincingly, to a date he claims he never checked. A pencil mark in a private calendar, in a hand that is not Julian Marsh's, placing him somewhere he demonstrably was not. And a beneficiary, chosen with what I'd now call considerable cunning, a mistress, publicly known, whose existence alone would draw every eye and every assumption of guilt toward her, and away from the 2 men who actually stood in the room when the felony was constructed. "Rees and Voss," I said, "working together." "I believe so. Consider the dependency each has upon the other. Rees requires a witness, a signature on the document beyond his own. Since a single witness invites scrutiny, a document needs to survive probate contest. And a physician witnessing his own patient's will is itself a flag no competent lawyer misses. He needed a second name, one with access to Marsh's private hours, his habits, his handwriting, his household. Voss, in turn, required something considerably simpler, money, or the promise of it, or perhaps something less tangible, ambition. A young man 8 months into a position of trust, watching an older, wealthier employer, is precisely the sort of man susceptible to a persuasive physician, twice his age, offering a share of $14 million in exchange for one signature, and one carefully rehearsed lie about a date he could plausibly claim never to have checked. "But Rees isn't named as a beneficiary," I said. "You said that yourself yesterday. If Vandermeer inherits, Rees doesn't see a dime unless there is an arrangement between them that exists nowhere Cobb has yet found." Wolfe said, "Or unless I have misjudged the structure entirely, and the true beneficiary of this scheme was never meant to be Miss Vandermeer at all, but rather whoever controls her interest, or negotiates on her behalf, or more elegantly still, whoever she might be persuaded or coerced to share with. Once the estate is settled, and the scandal has died down enough for a quiet private arrangement to pass unnoticed." He was quiet a moment. "I do not yet know which. I know only that Miss Vandermeer herself struck me, on Friday, as entirely too indignant, too plainly unrehearsed, to be a co-conspirator in her own windfall. Guilty parties do not generally arrive at my office begging to sign away $14 million to relieve their own reputations. So she's exactly what Cobb thought at the start," I said. "A convenient name. Somebody Rees and Voss picked because everyone would assume the worst of her before anyone looked past her." "Precisely so, though I suspect there is a personal cruelty in the choice beyond mere convenience. Voss knew of the relationship intimately. He was the one letting her into the house 11 times. It would take very little imagination for a resentful or ambitious young man to settle on the mistress as the ideal instrument. A woman already positioned, by circumstance and prejudice both, to absorb suspicion that might otherwise fall on the two men who actually built the fraud. Wolfe's expression had gone, for him, almost grim. "It is an ugly piece of architecture, Archie. Uglier than the money alone would explain. I want to know what Reese promised Voss, and I want to know it from Voss directly, because a young man persuaded into forgery by an older, more confident conspirator is generally the weaker joint in the structure. And weak joints, properly pressured, are where a case like this comes apart." He reached for the telephone himself, which he almost never does, and had Cobb on the line inside a minute. "Mr. Cobb," he said, "I want Dr. Reese and Mr. Voss both at this office Thursday evening, ostensibly to discuss a settlement regarding the disputed codicil. Tell them whatever framing makes that plausible, that the family is considering a negotiated resolution to avoid a public probate contest, and that their presence is required as witnesses to the document's execution. I want Mrs. Marsh present as well, and Mr. Cray, and Miss Vandermeer. Everyone in one room, Mr. Cobb, believing this is a negotiation." He paused, listening to whatever objection Cobb was raising on the other end. "No, I do not yet have proof that would satisfy a courtroom. I have architecture, as I said, and architecture is a fragile thing to present to men who built it themselves and know precisely where its foundations lie. I intend to apply pressure to the weakest point in front of witnesses, and I am reasonably confident it will not hold." He hung up and looked at me with the particular, unhurried satisfaction of a man who has already won an argument that hasn't happened yet. "Thursday, Archie, and I'd like the full history of Dr. Reese's finances by Wednesday evening. Every debt, every creditor, everything that might explain why $400,000 of quiet forgiveness was worth this much risk to a man who, until 18 months ago, had apparently lived an entirely respectable life." Wednesday's digging turned up exactly the kind of ledger Wolfe had been fishing for, though it took most of the day and a phone call to a contact at Reese's bank who owed me a favor going back 3 years to a matter I won't bore you with here. Holloway Reese, it turned out, had been quietly bleeding money for the better part of 2 years, a malpractice settlement paid privately to avoid a licensing board inquiry, a second mortgage on a Connecticut property, and a gambling habit at a private club on the East Side that 3 separate sources confirmed without much prompting once I mentioned the word murder. The $400,000 from Marsh hadn't covered a third of it. Reese hadn't been a man in trouble. He'd been a man drowning. I laid it all out for Wolfe Wednesday evening, and he listened with his eyes shut and his fingers laced over his stomach. And when I finished, he said only, "Good," which from Wolfe is roughly equivalent to another man standing up and applauding. Thursday evening, the office filled the way it fills for exactly this kind of occasion. Chairs brought in from the front room. Everyone arranged where Wolfe wanted them, and nobody quite realizing they'd been arranged. Cobb sat nearest the desk, looking like a man who'd aged 5 years in 2 weeks. Constance Marsh took the far end of the couch, composed as ever. Desmond Cray arrived last, and sat with his legs crossed and his face arranged in the particular patience of a man who intends to be unimpressed by whatever's coming. Elena Vandermeer sat rigid near the bookshelves, as far from Reese and Voss as the room allowed, which I noted, and suspected Wolfe had noted too. Reese and Voss took the 2 chairs nearest each other, which struck me as either innocent habit or something considerably less innocent. And I watched Voss's hands the whole time. They hadn't stopped moving since he walked in. "I understand," Wolfe began, once Fritz had cleared the last of the coffee cups, "that Mr. Cobb has represented this evening as a negotiation. That was a courtesy extended to bring you all into one room, and I apologize for the imprecision. But I did not wish to negotiate a settlement tonight. I wish to discuss a murder." Cray's leg uncrossed. Constance Marsh went very still. Reese's face didn't move at all, which I thought was itself worth noting. A man genuinely startled by an accusation of murder generally does something with his face, and Reese did nothing. which meant either remarkable composure or considerable rehearsal. Julian Marsh, Wolfe continued, died of what appeared to be a routine cardiac event, on medication his physician had, 3 weeks prior, quietly increased. No autopsy was performed, because his physician, the same man who stood to benefit from his patient's silence regarding a $400,000 loan that existed nowhere in writing, certified the death without requesting a toxicology screen he had every professional reason to request, and then, in the week following, inquired specifically about whether independent digoxin records existed outside that screen. That is not the behavior of a grieving physician, doctor. That is the behavior of a man checking whether his work has left a trace. This is slander, Reese said, but his voice had lost the smooth warmth of Wednesday's earlier visit. It came out thinner than he wanted it to. I've practiced medicine for 30 years, and I won't sit here. You'll sit, Wolfe said, without raising his voice, because leaving this room now would be considerably more damaging to you than remaining in it, and I suspect you know that better than anyone present. He let that settle before continuing. The Seventh Codicil, purporting to leave a third of Mr. Marsh's estate to Miss Vandermeer, was witnessed by yourself and by Mr. Voss, and dated the 11th of October, a day on which Mr. Marsh was demonstrably in Boston, a fact supported by a hotel bill, a driver's log, and 4 independent witnesses. Someone, in the weeks before his death, added a pencil notation to his private calendar in a hand that was not his own, placing him falsely in Larchmont that day. A fabrication laid down, Mr. Cobb assures me, well before anyone had reason to contest a will that did not yet exist as a point of controversy. That is not a forger improvising after a death, ladies and gentlemen. That is a man laying groundwork for a death he already expected. Voss had gone the color of the wallpaper. I never touched that calendar. I swear it. I never. I believe you, Wolfe said, and the room's attention swung to him with a kind of collective jolt. I believe, Mr. Voss, that you witnessed a signature you were told was genuine, on a date you were persuaded not to examine too closely, by a man 20 years your senior, whom Julian Marsh trusted implicitly, and whom you, understandably, trusted in turn. I believe you were the weaker instrument in this scheme, not its architect, which is precisely why I expect you, of everyone in this room, to have the least stomach for continuing to protect the man who built it. Voss looked at Reese. Reese looked back at him with an expression that had gone, in the space of that glance, from composed to something considerably colder. And I thought, there it is. That's the moment. That's the look a drowning man gives the one person he'd planned to pull down with him. Perry, Reese said, low, almost gentle, don't. He offered me $60,000, Voss said, and his voice cracked clean down the middle on the last word. I didn't write anything. I swear that's true. I only witnessed what he put in front of me and told me was already signed. And I didn't ask, because I didn't want to know. And I have hated myself every single day since Julian died, because I think I already suspected, and I signed anyway. And God help me, I don't know if that makes me as guilty as he is. The room had gone dead silent. Constance Marsh had one hand pressed flat against her mouth. Elena Vandermeer was crying, quietly, without moving to wipe it away. It doesn't, Wolfe said, and something in his voice had gone. For just that sentence, almost kind. Suspicion is not murder, Mr. Voss, whatever guilt you've assigned yourself in the small hours. But it is time, I think, for you to tell this room, and eventually a district attorney, precisely what Dr. Reese told you, and precisely when, and precisely how he explained away a signature you now understand was never Julian Marsh's at all. Reese was on his feet before Wolfe finished the sentence, and for one ugly second I thought he meant to go for the door. But Cray, of all people Cray, was closer and had a hand on his arm before he'd taken a full step, gripping it with the flat, unhurried strength of a man who'd spent 30 years in boardrooms, learning exactly how much pressure it takes to stop somebody without making a scene of it. Sit down, Holloway, Cray said, not unkindly. I think you'd better hear the rest of it. Reese sat, because Cray's grip didn't leave much room for alternatives. and for a moment, nobody spoke. Then Wolfe, who'd been waiting for exactly this pause, the way a conductor waits for an orchestra to settle, set his hands flat on the desk. "Since Mr. Voss has been more forthcoming than his co-conspirator," he said, "allow me to complete the architecture for the rest of you, so that everyone in this room understands precisely what occurred and why." He looked at Reese, whose face had settled into something bleak and resigned, a man who'd finally stopped performing composure, because there was no longer an audience worth performing for. Dr. Reese was, by last year, a man in considerable and mounting financial distress, a malpractice settlement paid privately, a second mortgage, and debts accrued at a private gaming club that I will not name, but that Mr. Goodwin has confirmed with 3 independent sources. Julian Marsh, an old friend and a trusting patient, lent him $400,000 informally, without documentation, on nothing more than a handshake and 2 decades of acquaintance. That informality, which Mr. Marsh likely intended as a kindness, became instead Dr. Reese's temptation. A debt that exists nowhere in writing, dies with the only man who can attest to its terms. Dr. Reese did not need Julian Marsh dead for revenge, or for love, or for any of the motives that usually animate this kind of business. He needed him dead for silence, an inheritance of forgiveness, worth considerably more to a drowning man than any single line in a will. He turned his eyes toward Voss, whose hands had finally stilled. But silence alone would not explain $14 million diverted to Miss Vandermeer. And here is where the scheme reveals its second and crueler ambition. I do not believe, Dr. Reese, that you constructed the Seventh Codicil merely to erase a debt. I believe you constructed it to profit from the death you were arranging, and that you required a beneficiary whose existence would deflect all scrutiny from yourself. A woman already publicly known as Mr. Marsh's mistress, whom the family, the police, and frankly most reasonable observers would suspect long before they thought to examine a physician's prescription pad. Miss Vandermeer's genuine indignation, her repeated insistence that she wanted none of the money, has been evident to me since the moment she sat in that chair. Guilty beneficiaries do not beg to sign away fortunes. Innocent ones, humiliated by an accusation not their own, frequently do. "There's no arrangement," Reese said, dully, staring at the floor. "Not with her. She never knew a thing about it." "I know," Wolfe said, "which raises the final question, and the one I suspect matters most to a district attorney. What did you intend to do with a $14 million bequest sitting in the name of a woman who wanted none of it and knew nothing of the scheme that produced it?" "I believe the answer is patience, Dr. Reese. I believe you intended, once the estate settled and the scandal quieted, to approach Miss Vandermeer, perhaps as a sympathetic advisor, helping an overwhelmed young woman navigate an inheritance she never asked for, and negotiate a private arrangement for a substantial portion of it, dressed up as fees, as gratitude, as anything that would survive a second glance. A man patient enough to titrate a dosage over 3 weeks and forge a calendar months in advance is a man patient enough to wait a year for the second half of his plan to mature." Nobody in the room said anything. Elena Vandermeer had stopped crying and was staring at Reese with an expression I can only describe as the particular fury of somebody realizing in real time exactly how they'd been used. "The digoxin," Wolfe continued, quieter now. "I do not know, and I suspect no court ever will with certainty, precisely what combination Dr. Reese employed to push Julian Marsh's narrow cardiac margin past its limit on that particular night, given that the body was cremated within the week per Mr. Marsh's own long-standing instructions. Instructions Dr. Reese, I imagine, was well aware of, and which removed the one form of evidence that might have contradicted a heart attack cleanly. But a dosage increase 3 weeks prior, a physician's refusal to request a toxicology screen he had every professional reason to request, and a subsequent inquiry into whether independent records of that dosage existed. These are not individually proof of murder. Together, doctor, in front of witnesses, they are considerably harder to explain away as coincidence. and I suspect a competent prosecutor will find Mr. Voss's testimony regarding $60,000 considerably more useful than you'd like." Reese said nothing at all. Cobb had already risen and moved toward the telephone in the front room, and I didn't need Wolfe to tell me to go make sure he got through to the district attorney's office without incident. So I did, and by the time I came back, Cray had let go of Reese's arm, though the doctor hadn't moved from his chair. Hadn't moved at all, really, except to put his face in his hands. Constance Marsh was the one who finally broke the silence, and what she said surprised me, coming from a woman who'd spent 31 years married to a man who'd never quite been faithful to her. "He didn't deserve this," she said, quietly, to no one in particular. "Whatever he was to me, whatever he was to her," a small nod toward Elena, "not unkind. He didn't deserve to be poisoned by a man he trusted with his own heart, over a debt he'd have forgiven if anyone had simply asked him to." Nobody had an answer for that, because there wasn't one, and I've found over the years that Wolfe generally knows better than to try supplying comfort where none is owed and none would fit. The district attorney's men came for Reese within the hour, and Voss went with them too, though everyone in that room, including Wolfe, suspected the boy would end up a cooperating witness rather than a co-defendant by the time the lawyers finished sorting out degrees of culpability. Elena Vandermeer left last, and stopped at the door to shake Wolfe's hand, which surprised him enough that he actually stood up for it, a courtesy he extends maybe twice a year. "I still don't want the money," she told him. "That," Wolfe said, "is between you and Mr. Cobb, and none of my concern whatsoever. I solve murders, Miss Vandermeer. I do not solve consciences," which was about as close to gentle as I've ever heard him get with a client who wasn't paying him, and I noted it, the way I note most things, for later. Sterling Cobb settled up 2 days afterward, considerably more than the case had technically required, which I put down to relief rather than generosity, though with lawyers it's frequently hard to tell the difference. Wolfe spent that evening back among the orchids where he belonged, and I spent it at my desk, finishing the notes you've just read, thinking about a dead man's cremation instructions filed 11 years before anyone had reason to use them, and how a good deal of murder, in my experience, isn't really about hatred at all. It's about patience. Cold, unhurried, well-funded patience, dressed up afterward as grief. Julian Marsh had trusted his doctor with his heart in every sense that word allows, and it had killed him in the end, which strikes me as about the ugliest kind of irony a case has handed me in some while. I poured myself a short one before I went up to bed, and I'll admit I raised the glass, briefly and privately, to a piano teacher who'd wanted nothing from $14 million except to be left alone, which, in my professional experience, makes her about the only entirely honest person in the whole sorry business.